The wind cut across the deck of the HMS Ark Royal like a blade, sharp and salt-stained, carrying with it the taste of diesel and brine. Below, in the aircraft hangar, a mechanic steadied a swordfish biplane against the rolling swell, his hands black with grease, his breath fogging in the cold. Above him, officers tracked German U-boats through static-filled radios, their voices clipped and methodical. Somewhere beyond the gray curtain of horizon, war was becoming something new, something that would not be decided by the thunder of 16-inch guns or the armor plating of dreadnoughts, but by fragile machines that took off from floating runways and disappeared into clouds. No one yet understood how completely the old order would shatter. No one yet knew that the battleship, that steel cathedral of naval supremacy, was already dying. For 4 centuries, naval power had been measured in tonnage and broadside weight. From the Spanish Armada to Jutland, from Nelson's victory to the German high seas fleet, the logic of maritime warfare had been elegantly simple. Build the largest ships, mount the heaviest guns, armor them until they became floating fortresses, and send them to meet the enemy in open water. The battleship was not merely a weapon, it was a symbol. It represented industrial might, national prestige, the projection of empire across the oceans. When Kaiser Wilhelm saw Britain's dreadnoughts, he built his own. When America emerged as a power, it launched the Arizona and the Pennsylvania. And when Japan, a nation that had been closed to the world only decades before, sought recognition as a great power, it did so by constructing the most magnificent battleships the world had ever seen. In the 1930s, as treaties crumbled and tensions rose, the Japanese Navy embarked on an audacious gamble. They designed the Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, vessels so enormous, so heavily armed, that they defied rational comparison. The Yamato displaced over 70,000 tons. Her main guns were 18.1 inches in diameter, the largest ever mounted on a warship, capable of hurling shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds across distances of 25 miles. Her armor belt was 16 inches thick in places, immune to nearly any shell fired by an enemy battleship. To the officers who walked her decks, to the engineers who fitted her turbines, she was invincible. She was proof that Japan belonged at the table of empires. She was the future. Except she wasn't. Across the Pacific, in the shipyards of Newport News and Bremerton, a different kind of vessel was taking shape. The Americans were building carriers, flat-decked giants designed not to fight gun to gun, but to launch aircraft that could strike from beyond the horizon. The Lexington, the Saratoga, the Enterprise, the Yorktown. These ships carried no heavy guns. Their decks were runways, their magazines filled not with armor-piercing shells, but with bombs and torpedoes. They were fragile by comparison, vulnerable to fire and explosion, dependent on the skill of young pilots who flew planes made of aluminum and canvas, and yet, quietly, without fanfare, they were rewriting the rules of naval combat. The Japanese understood carriers. They had them too: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku. On December 7, 1941, it was carriers that delivered the blow at Pearl Harbor, sending waves of dive bombers and torpedo planes against the American Pacific Fleet. The attack was devastatingly effective. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. Over 2,000 Americans died. But there was something the Japanese missed, something that would cost them everything. The American carriers were not in port that morning. Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. Lexington was near Midway. Saratoga was in San Diego. They survived. And in that survival lay the seed of Japan's destruction. For 6 months, Japan swept across the Pacific with a speed and ferocity that stunned the world. Hong Kong fell, Singapore fell, the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies all fell. Japanese forces captured oil fields, airfields, harbors. They pushed into the Solomon Islands and threatened Australia. The perimeter of their empire stretched from the Aleutians to the Indian Ocean, encompassing millions of square miles and hundreds of millions of people. At the center of this offensive were the carriers, the Kido Butai, the striking force that had crushed the Allies at every turn. But the battleships, the mighty Yamato, the newly completed Musashi, remained in port, too valuable to risk, too powerful to be squandered in anything less than the decisive fleet engagement that Japanese doctrine demanded. They waited. They waited for the great clash that would justify their existence, the climactic battle in which they would annihilate the American fleet in a single overwhelming confrontation. They waited for Tsushima to happen again. The Americans did not wait. Bloodied but not broken, they rebuilt, they studied, they adapted. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, understood what many of his peers did not. The war would not be won by battleships slugging it out at visual range, but by carriers striking from distances measured in hundreds of miles. Intelligence officers worked around the clock, breaking Japanese codes, mapping their movements, anticipating their plans. Pilots trained in Hawaii and California, learning to dive bomb moving targets, to launch torpedoes in the teeth of anti-aircraft fire, to land on pitching decks in weather that would have grounded anyone sane. They were young, most of them, boys who had grown up during the Depression, who had never seen combat, who had joined the Navy for the paycheck and now found themselves at the edge of history. By May 1942, the Japanese were planning their next move. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, proposed an operation so bold it seemed to border on madness: the invasion of Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,400 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway itself was insignificant, but its capture would extend Japan's defensive perimeter, threaten Hawaii, and most importantly, draw out the American carriers for the decisive battle Yamamoto craved. He assembled the most powerful naval force in history: 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships including Yamato, 16 cruisers, dozens of destroyers, hundreds of aircraft. It was an armada that dwarfed anything the Americans could field. It was invincible. Except the Americans knew it was coming. Station Hypo, the cryptanalysis unit at Pearl Harbor, had been reading Japanese codes for weeks. They knew the target, they knew the date, they knew the composition of the fleet. Nimitz gambled everything on this intelligence. He ordered Enterprise, Hornet, and the hardily repaired Yorktown, damaged just weeks earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea, to converge northeast of Midway. 3 carriers against 4. No battleships. No margin for error. The Japanese expected surprise. Instead, they sailed into a trap. June 4, 1942. Dawn broke clear over the Pacific, the sky a vault of pale blue, the sea calm and glittering. At 4:30 hours, Japanese aircraft began launching from their carriers, 108 planes heading towards Midway to soften its defenses before the invasion force arrived. Below decks, mechanics armed the remaining aircraft with torpedoes, preparing for the moment when American ships would be spotted. On the Japanese carriers, confidence was absolute. They had never lost. They did not believe they could lose. At 0534, the first American reconnaissance plane spotted the Japanese fleet. By 0603, radar on Midway picked up the incoming strike. Fighters scrambled. Anti-aircraft guns swung skyward. The Japanese hit the island hard, cratering runways, destroying fuel tanks, but Midway held. Its planes, obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and lumbering TBF Avengers, launched desperate counterattacks against the Japanese carriers. They were slaughtered. The Zeros, nimble and lethal, tore them apart. Of the 41 American aircraft that attacked that morning from Midway, only a handful returned. It seemed, for a moment, like every other battle. Japanese supremacy, American sacrifice, a foregone conclusion. But then came the carriers. At 0702, a PBY Catalina spotted the Japanese fleet and radioed its position. On Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, klaxons sounded. Pilots sprinted to their aircraft. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters, everything that could fly launched into the sky, forming up in loose formations and heading southwest. They did not know, most of them, exactly where the enemy was. They did not have fighter escorts for much of the flight. They were hunting the most powerful carrier force on Earth with aircraft that were slow, underarmed, and vulnerable. They went anyway. The torpedo squadrons arrived first. VT-8 from Hornet, 15 TBD Devastators flying low and slow attacked the Japanese carriers without fighter cover. The Zeros fell on them like hawks. One by one, the Devastators were shot down, their crews dying in fire and salt water. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, clinging to a seat cushion in the ocean, watching the battle unfold around him. VT-6 from Enterprise and VT-3 from Yorktown followed, and they too were destroyed. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 returned. Not a single torpedo hit its target. It seemed like annihilation. It seemed like proof that the Japanese could not be beaten. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Kido Butai, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The American attacks had been uncoordinated, suicidal, ineffective. His carriers were intact. His aircraft were rearming. In minutes, he would launch a counterstrike that would obliterate the American fleet. He had won. And then the dive bombers arrived. At 022 hours, 33 SBD Dauntlesses from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, emerged from a cloud bank 7,000 feet above the Japanese fleet. Below them, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu steamed in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft, fuel hoses snaking across the wood planking, bombs and torpedoes stacked and ready. The Japanese had been so focused on the low-altitude torpedo attacks that they had not seen the dive bombers climbing above them. Now it was too late. McCluskey gave the order. The Dauntlesses rolled into their dives, near vertical plunges toward the carriers below, wind screaming past their canopies, altimeter spinning, the targets growing larger and larger. Anti-aircraft fire erupted, black puffs filling the sky, shrapnel tearing through wings and fuselages, but the bombers kept coming. At 2,000 feet, they released. 1,000-pound bombs falling, tumbling, accelerating toward the decks below. The first bomb struck Akagi amidships, penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the hangar among aircraft being fueled and armed. Fire exploded through the ship, igniting fuel, cooking off ammunition, turning the carrier into an inferno. Seconds later, Kaga was hit, then hit again, bombs ripping through her deck, setting off torpedoes, blowing holes in her hull. Soryu, attacking separately by dive bombers from Yorktown, took 3 hits in as many minutes and erupted in flames. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were burning wrecks, their crews abandoning ship, their aircraft consumed by fire. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, survived long enough to launch a counterstrike that crippled Yorktown, but by late afternoon, she too was found and destroyed by American dive bombers. 4 carriers, gone. Not by battleship guns, not by surface engagement, but by young men in fragile aircraft dropping bombs from the sky. The Yamato, the pride of the Japanese fleet, the most powerful battleship ever constructed, was there. She was part of the armada. Her guns, capable of destroying anything afloat, never fired a shot. She could not engage an enemy she could not see. She could not defend carriers burning 300 miles away. She steamed in circles, majestic and useless, a relic of a war that had already ended. In the days and weeks that followed Midway, the enormity of what had happened began to settle over the Japanese Navy like ash. 4 fleet carriers lost, 300 aircraft destroyed, hundreds of experienced pilots and aircrew dead, the offensive momentum shattered, the myth of invincibility broken. Yamamoto, who had warned before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months but could not sustain a prolonged conflict with America, watched his prediction come true. Midway was not merely a defeat, it was a revelation. It proved that carriers, not battleships, were the capital ships of modern naval warfare. It proved that American industrial power, which could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them, was the ultimate weapon. And it proved that doctrine, no matter how deeply rooted, no matter how glorious its history, was worthless if it could not adapt to reality. The Yamato would sail again. She would participate in other operations, fire her guns in anger only once at escort carriers off Samar in 1944, and spend most of the war as a floating headquarters, too precious to risk, too expensive to lose. In April 1945, ordered on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa, she was caught in open water by American carrier aircraft and sunk under a deluge of bombs and torpedoes, her massive guns silent, her armor pierced, her crew dying by the thousands as she capsized and exploded. She had been designed to dominate. Instead, she became a monument to obsolescence. The Americans, meanwhile, built carriers by the dozen. Essex-class fleet carriers rolled out of shipyards at a pace Japan could never match. Light carriers, escort carriers, planes by the thousands, Hellcats, Corsairs, Avengers. By 1944, the American Navy operated more carriers than the rest of the world combined. They swarmed across the Pacific, launching raids on Truk, Palau, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Japanese battleships, when they were encountered, were obliterated from the air. The Musashi was sunk by carrier aircraft in the Sibuyan Sea, absorbing dozens of torpedoes and bombs before finally succumbing. Surface engagements, the kind that had defined naval warfare for centuries, became rare, almost accidental. The war was fought and won by pilots who never saw their enemy's face, by bombs dropped from 12,000 feet, by torpedoes launched from planes that disappeared before the explosions settled. Midway was the fulcrum. It was the moment when doctrine collided with reality and shattered. It was the battle that should not have been won, fought by a fleet that should have been destroyed, against an enemy that could not imagine losing. The Japanese had built their strategy on the assumption that steel and firepower would prevail, that the decisive battle would come down to gunnery and armor and the willingness to fight to the death. They had not accounted for the fact that the Americans would refuse to fight that battle, that they would strike from beyond the horizon, again and again, with aircraft that could be replaced, pilots who could be trained, carriers that could be built faster than they could be sunk. The Japanese had built for Tsushima. The Americans brought the future. There is a photograph taken sometime in 1943 of an American carrier in the Pacific. The deck is crowded with aircraft, wings folded, engines silent. Sailors in dungarees and helmets move between the planes, checking fuel lines, loading ordnance. Beyond the flight deck, the ocean stretches to infinity, empty and indifferent. Somewhere out there, beneath those waves, lie the wrecks of battleships, Japanese, American, British, German. Ships that once symbolized power and prestige, now graves for men who believed in them. The carriers sailed on, the war moved forward, and the age of the battleship, that long and glorious age, ended not with a final climactic duel, but with silence, with rust, with steel settling into the mud of 100 harbors and battlefield seas, unremembered and unmourned. What the Japanese learned at Midway, they learned too late. that industrial capacity matters more than individual superiority, that flexibility defeats rigidity, that the weapon you worship can become the chain that drowns you. They had built the Yamato to rule the seas, to embody the spirit of the samurai, to strike a blow so devastating that the Americans would sue for peace. Instead, they discovered that war is not poetry. It is production lines. It is intelligence work. It is the unglamorous calculus of resources and logistics and the willingness to discard yesterday's certainties when tomorrow demands something new. The Americans adapted. The Japanese did not. That is the entire story of the Pacific War. And so Midway stands, not just as a battle, but as a parable about the danger of fighting the last war, about the seduction of symbols over substance, about the hubris of believing that what worked before will work forever. The battleship was magnificent. It was also doomed. Not because it was flawed, but because the world changed, and it could not. The carrier, fragile and ungainly, became the instrument of victory not because it was superior in any absolute sense, but because it was suited to the war that was actually being fought, not the war that doctrine imagined. In the end, the sea remembers everything and nothing. The Yamato rests somewhere off Kyushu, her hull broken, her guns silent, her name a whisper in history books. The carriers that killed her have long since been scrapped, their steel recycled, their stories fading. But the lesson remains, stark and unforgiving, written in salt water and blood and the bones of ships that could not adapt. Midway did not just prove that carriers ruled the seas, it proved that no weapon, no matter how powerful, can survive the collision between myth and reality. And it proved, once and for all, that the future belongs not to those who build the largest guns, but to those who see the battlefield as it is, not as they wish it to be.